Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, wherever in the world you may be joining us from today. My name is Francesco Del Carpio, and I am the Operations Coordinator for CFL York. I would like to officially open the 14th session of the Climate Change Emergencies and Cultural Heritage Speaker Series, which is being presented in partnership with Heritage Ottawa and World Heritage Catalysis. I would like to begin today's session with a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge and recognize that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territory upon which our campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. The area is known as Takaranto and has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. The territory is subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. As this is an online event, our participants may be joining from various locations, so I strongly encourage you to learn about the traditional land upon which you are located. With this, I welcome our moderator, our speaker, and our participants from around the world. Welcome to our webinar. It is now my great pleasure to introduce our moderator today, Cecily Smith Christensen. Cecily Smith Christensen is a Norwegian economist, heritage and tourism professional, and the founder of World Heritage Catalysis. After many years focusing on sustainable tourism in and around UNESCO World Heritage Sites, Ms. Smith Christensen is, in the context of climate change, increasingly focusing on how to enhance adaptive and transformative capacities within tourism host communities. In 2008, after 7 years in Africa, she moved back to Norway, joining the Nordic World Heritage Foundation as deputy director. In this role, she worked closely with the World Heritage Center and Nordic Baltic Site Management Authorities to develop and implement the new World Heritage Sustainable Tourism Program in 2011. In 2014, she founded World Heritage Catalysis. Commissioned by UNESCO, she focuses on facilitating the development of strategies for managing the relationship between heritage protection and tourism, and developing and implementing the UNESCO World Heritage Visitor Management Assessment and Strategy Tool, or VMAST. Cecily, thank you very much for moderating today's session. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you so much for this opportunity. And it's my great pleasure to introduce today's speakers, Antonio Gomez Palacio. Antonio is internationally recognized for transforming cities into vibrant urban spaces that respond to the social, economic, and environmental context. As dialogue chair, his mission is to deliver design solutions to the many challenges we face globally. He is frequently called upon to lead conversations on how the built environment can contribute to community well-being. Antonio inspires leaders to achieve meaningful impact through various topics: housing affordability, city livability, climate adaptation, social equity, well-being, heritage, and sustainability. He became a fellow of the Royal Architectural Institute of Canada College in 2018, recognized for his outstanding contribution to the design community. After his presentations, I will moderate the discussion. So please, while Antonio is presenting, contribute to questions and comments into the Q&A sessions in the chat. And with this, I welcome Antonio to take the floor, or rather the screen, and we are very much looking forward to your presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cecile, and thank you, Francesco. I'm hoping everybody can see that screen by now. But yeah, absolutely. I'll run through a presentation, and hopefully what we can do is have a little bit of a conversation afterwards. So if anybody has thoughts throughout, please add them to the chat, and we can accrue your own comments or any questions that you may have. I think Cecile will be having a peek at those throughout, and so will I when I can through the presentation. But let me start giving you a little bit of the origin story. So this is me many years ago. I was trying to place it, when your teeth fall off, I'm probably closer to 10 years old. But I grew up in the mountains in Mexico, central Mexico. This is a photograph, in fact, of the church where I was married. It's a little chapel. This is the original lands of the Masawa and the Nahuatl people. And by the 1500s, this little chapel was built. The photograph is from last year. And it really is very much a rural community that was the origins of where much of my what I'll be talking about started. This is the bigger town nearby. It's Valle de Bravo, and this is the church where my kids were baptized. This is the central square. You can see that little church to the right. But this is what I knew for the first many years of my life. But then I moved to Mexico City, and by 1985, on September 19th, the city experienced a tremendous earthquake. It damaged a huge proportion of buildings. And I was in the middle of high school, and all of a sudden found myself spending days and weeks helping out, trying to bring people the security they needed and the help that they needed throughout. But the earthquake really, not only was it transformative for myself, it really was transformative for the entire country. It mobilized civil society. It started to shift the political spectrum that to this day has completely changed the politics of the country. But you can imagine how impressionable a high school student would be going through all of this. So by the time that my beginning of university started, I entered architecture school, and really with the questions around how could I start to address some of the issues of affordable housing and social equity and some of these elements. A few years later, and in fact, halfway through architecture school, I got a job offer to go to Hong Kong. So I go to Hong Kong and start working for the Hong Kong Housing Authority. And this is one of the projects I got to work on. This is the Forgotten City in Kowloon, which was really a tremendous. So this is a photo that I've downloaded, but these are photos that I took at that time in 1992, which just before all of this was demolished to create new affordable housing. It was within the flight path of the airport, so you can imagine an incredible place to be at as a young professional. But coming back to Mexico, finishing off my architecture degree, it was really clear to me that the issues that we were facing at a global scale were much larger than what I was being able to address in school at the time, and certainly as I started in the profession. Even today, if you start to look at the global income distribution, the vast majority of the world, 85% of the world population, lives under the poverty line. So no matter what country you're looking at this webinar from and where you have come from, a portion of this is probably true within your own communities. So today we are here to talk about the confluence of climate change and heritage. I will try and bring this into a conversation around how it affects people, how it really becomes compounded in particular segments of the population. And clearly, I don't need to dwell too much on aspects of climate change, but the incidence of extreme natural disasters has only continued to increase year after year after year. I'm in Edmonton today experiencing a heat wave after floods happening in through the Gulf of Mexico also today, and these things continue to compound. Not unconnected, world population is increasing as well. And importantly for us to note, within my lifespan, we have transitioned from being a primarily rural society, as when I was growing up, to today, an urban society, as I live today in the places where I work as well. And of course, we are now at a stage, and we have been for the length of my lifespan, in a place where we are consuming more of the planet than what the planet is able to replenish for itself. So clearly, these things are connected, and we need to start to think about it. If I show you these two apples, and I ask you which of these two apples would you take a bite into, clearly we have thousands, if not millions of years of genetic disposition for us to know which of these two apples will contribute to your health and well-being, and which one looks appealing and which one do you want to bite into. But if I was to ask you which of these two environments would you want to contribute to your health and well-being, and which ones would you like to be in? I'd like to think most people are looking at the image on the left and say, well, that's the one that is the one that contributes to my health and well-being. But nevertheless, it's the one on the right that we continue to build time and time again. And I'm not sure where you're watching this from, but I'd venture to imagine that there's places within your communities that look not too dissimilar to that. There's certainly a lot of places around the world that look not too dissimilar to the image on the right. So, first interactive moment. I'll pause briefly because I really want, in the same vein that I've just given you my own origin story and the places that I inhabit, have you define yourself a little bit. Think about, how do you articulate your own sense of identity, and how do you really start to think about your place in the world, and how do you define yourself? And keep that one, because we will be thinking about that certainly through the Q&A. Ready? So I'll make a couple of arguments through the course of today. The first one that is, of course, that the whole conversation around climate change is not about a question about the planet. The planet will survive just fine. It's a question about people. It's a question of the life choices that we are engaging in and the impact it has on ourselves. And we really need to understand and refocus the conversation around what we are doing to the planet has an impact on ourselves. Similarly, the conversation around heritage is not about the bricks and the mortar, right? It's not about the buildings and the artifacts. They don't care. They don't have an opinion. Again, it's about people. It's about ourselves. So if we really need to be thinking about this whole conversation around climate and around conservation and heritage, it's about the people who are part of it, the people who are impacted, the people whose legacy we're going to be engaging. So the big conundrum with climate change clearly is that it threatens the stability that previous generations took for granted and upon which they thrived. I can no longer know for certain what kind of climate, what kind of planet, what kind of weather conditions and ecology and life-sustaining natural systems my kids and potentially grandkids are going to have. So that threat, that's the one that is a real focus for, of course, all of the conversations around climate. Similarly, it's the question around heritage. What is the legacy that we are passing, and the sense of identity, the sense of place, the sense of selves that we are passing on to the next generations? So both the conversation around climate change and the conversation around heritage not only conflate with the notion that it's about people, it's also a conversation not about the past, it's a conversation about the future. It's a conversation around what are we going to do moving forward. And of course, there's many ways in which this point has been emphasized over the years. Those that are in Toronto today or in Ontario will know that the Heritage Act and the Heritage Policy Review has very clearly stated that heritage is all of those things that we value and that survive us in the living context, but that also provides sustenance and coherence and meaning to our individual and collective lives. And in Ontario, the conversation is very much around both the tangible things, so structures, landscapes, districts, and the intangible, right? The history that we pass on through documents and artifacts, but also through the stories that we tell. But it's also been in many other places. The Declaration of Amsterdam, 1975, that declaration itself should almost get heritage status by now. But it really speaks to the notion that heritage will only survive if the next generation cares about it. If we are able to transmit not just the actual elements of the heritage, but the reasons why it matters, the very reasons why somebody should care, and that they need to be able to adopt those reasons and make them their own. Tony Tung, who was the commissioner for the landmarks preservation in New York, was known for describing that the biggest threat that heritage faces is an allure for a better future. But I will argue that the strongest tool at our disposal in terms of both addressing climate and addressing heritage is going to be if we can articulate the connection of how a vision for the future can take place. And if we can articulate that, then the next generation can care, the next generation will make it their own. Heritage as climate is also one of these conditions where it takes 1,000 yeses to keep something alive, and it just takes one no to destroy it. One no for us to lose the connection between a long life of conservation of natural environment, but also the conservation of heritage resources. So it boils down very much to the question of why. Why should somebody care? Why should the next generation care? Why does all of this, why this matter? And this is a question, frankly, that we need to answer in a different way in every single context. It's not one where I could provide an answer or anybody watching this can provide a singular answer that is going to apply everywhere. We need to be asking within the communities, within families, within different environments, why does it matter? And what are we going to do about it is going to build on this notion. And in many areas, it does have to be with that sense of identity. It has to do with creating opportunities for the next generations to thrive. It's about supporting cultural and economic vitality, but it's also about its connections to sustainability. But arguably, we continue to see this connection between heritage and climate emerge again and again in conversations, and even through a lot of the news media and articles. This particular one on the screen is making the connection between embodied carbon in buildings, not just the heritage listed and designated buildings, but any building that is currently standing already has an embodied carbon. And being able to really articulate how we see those moving forward is also one of how do we address climate mitigation and climate adaptation. So the question for us is really, what is the legacy that we inherit and how are we going to conserve it? And more importantly, how are we going to maintain that as relevant? Why should the next generation care? And how is that going to be able to carry forward? And if we think ourselves as contemporary, ultimately contemporary means inhabiting the present tense. The question for us is, how do we do that with both a sense of the past and a vision for the future? How are we able to, within our communities, within our settings, within the jobs that we do on a daily basis or the choices that we make on a daily basis, really be able to create that bridge between a sense of the past, those things that we want to move forward, either healthy natural systems or a sense of identity and culture, and the vision that we have for the future, a community that thrives and a sense of well-being. And being able to articulate that, that is the job of ourselves today and of any society during its time. So what does that actually look like? If that is the challenge, how can we start to think about this more broadly? I'll give you a couple of examples. So this is Woodbridge. In 1954, huge hurricane, Hurricane Hazel, made its way through the city of Vaughan and destroyed and carved completely a new path for what is today the Humber River. At that time, Woodbridge had multiple bridges all around the community. The bridges, the river and the creeks powered a whole series of flour mill sites that were the driving economy for the community. All of that was destroyed. And in one fell sweep, the moment of the time, an extreme climate event resulted in the transformation of the community. But nevertheless, a lot of the heritage structures resided, a lot of the agricultural systems that were the identity of the landscapes resided in the community, transformed itself. And that original settlement of the city or the town of Woodbridge, and you can see the fairgrounds on the right-hand side, and now the new carved Humber River down the middle of that framed aerial, has now completely been surrounded by the rest of the city of Vaughan. But today, that city that has grown around still retains a tremendous amount of the original settlement, and it retains some elements of that history. So when we approach it with really trying to understand how do we create a heritage district and a conservation heritage district in this space, it was fundamental for us to really understand the confluence of both the sense of identity and the environmental impacts that could still take place. So a floodplain mapping today is what you can see, anticipated flood areas in blue, is again wiping out half of that heritage stock. So if we were to encounter a flood today, we would be experiencing pretty much a similar circumstance as in 1954, just from some of the impacts on some of those heritage buildings. So this is not an issue that is taken away with climate change. This is an issue that becomes further compounded. These are some of the listed designated properties, you know, the history of them, certainly the amount of landscapes that remain within the village, and some of the bridges that survive the original flood, and many of the buildings that continue to create that sense of identity, and some of the resulting character areas. But what I want to draw your attention to is, of course, now the incorporation of policies moving forward that are trying to both create a sense of the conservation of some of this sense of identity and some of these spaces, at the same time as addressing climate, as addressing, in this case, the context of flooding. And even in fact, the whole design of the streetscapes so that they are able to withstand extreme weather events and be able to survive across floods. But the example of Woodbridge is an example where we're still focusing on singularly those floods, on those extreme weather events. What I'm hoping that we can do today is also pull out of that and look at some of the social sphere. And what are those things that anybody who is represented on this screen can really be doing something about? You know, urban planning, urban design, architecture, engineering, communities, you know, a group of residents trying to build a park, a resident association or a neighborhood group trying to think about how can they think about their own spaces and build into it not just the resilience and the climate adaptation and mitigation, but also bring forward the sense of identity that they want to build upon a stronger vision for the city. So with that in mind, Dialogue, the company that I am part of, we've really kind of focused all of our work on those areas where we can meaningfully improve the well-being of communities and really understand how we can address these big world problems through the context of design, through the context of building neighborhoods, building buildings, communities, civic buildings, hospitals, you know, all these kinds of structures. So I'll invite you to really think about, and this is what I'll spend the second half of this presentation on, is how can we bring in that social dimension? How can we bring into bear a bigger understanding of what, in fact, are the bases upon which we can build the vision for a community on the basis of the sense of identity, the sense of the past that we want to move forward into the future. And this is the definition of community well-being now that many different organizations have adopted. New Zealand has adopted it at a federal level, and in fact, all different kind of decisions that come to the federal level are tested against this definition. But I want to draw the attention on a couple of things. you'll all remember the three pillars of sustainability: social, economic, environmental. Sometimes you'll see the word cultural thrown in as a fourth pillar, but this definition has five. And you'll notice the word political in there. What that means is who sits around the table when key decisions are made, when conversations are held, matters. The voices of who is participating matter to the outcomes. This is so fundamental to the definition that it's actually emphasized a second time in the second part of the definition. Individuals in communities need to be part of the process that defines their well-being, and how these vision and how this bridging the past and the future is to be articulated. So with this in mind, and working with the Conference Board of Canada and CERES, the Centre for Research on Disabilities, and many other organizations, there was a development of the Community Wellbeing Framework, which you can download from the Conference Board of Canada's website. But it really tries to articulate how to make that bridge. So it starts with that definition and the five domains that I talked about, including the political one, and clearly a series of indicators, and importantly, questions that needed to be asked. Because as soon as this is about a conversation, as soon as this is about including people, it means we no longer have prescribed outcomes that can predefine how to design a community, how to build a building, how to establish a particular context. What you can have is some really intelligent and well-informed questions to be bringing into the conversation. So this is what I will walk us through for a second. So the first domain is that social domain. This is an example from the Banks in Saskatoon, which is a residential building right at the edge of the river that has also incorporated mixed income and affordable housing in a mix of uses. But clearly the first question or first indicator that we need to be asking is about creating an environment that is welcoming. That means that we need to be thinking from the outset of any project, who is going to be part of this? And how are we creating an environment that is truly inclusive of everybody that needs to be part of not just the conversation, but the outcomes themselves? We cannot have a conversation around heritage or climate or anything else if we're not in parallel having a conversation around inclusion, if we're not in parallel having a conversation around who needs to be part of this very conversation in the first place. Second one is, of course, support systems. Not everybody can participate in the same way because we're all coming from different places. So we need to clearly be understanding in the design of an environment, what are the support systems that people need to be able to undertake their activities of everyday life. In some instances, they're very basic things: access to health, access to healthy food, access to safe and secure housing. But it's also access to childcare or senior care, access to recreation, all kinds of things. And we need to be addressing these things. Otherwise, we're never going to be able to create that environment that let alone contributes to well-being, but an environment that truly is going to be conducive for us to have a serious conversation around conserving heritage and addressing climate. A third indicator here is around socialization. And this is very much around building the social capital that communities need in order to be resilient, in order to be able to support each other and help each other move forward. But clearly, socialization is one of those areas that needs to be addressed singularly. We know that we can reduce the isolation of seniors if there's great places for people to socialize, or the suicidal rate amongst teenagers. There's many things that can be addressed if we simply put a specific attention on a robust public realm, indoors and outdoors. Second domain, interconnected with all of this, of course, is that of the environment. But think of the social dimension in it. So the first indicator here is delight and enjoyment. If people cannot find a rewarding space, if they're not able to actually enjoy those spaces, then they'll never be able to contribute to their mental health, to their ability to participate within the community in a healthy way. So what does that mean? It means access to daylight, access to natural ventilation, biophilia, views to nature. We know that we can push off early onset dementia if we just have some of these spaces well defined, let alone enable a community and children to grow in a healthier environment and people to participate in a stronger way. And of course, the health of the natural systems. The quality of natural ecosystem services that support the life of ourselves and everybody else. The health of air, water, greenhouse gases, carbon. We need to be addressing all of those in terms of the interconnection between natural systems and the ecology and the people that inhabit the spaces that we're looking at. Mobility is a particular one that has attracted a tremendous amount of literature around this, supporting active lifestyles, reducing car dependency. And if this was the only issue at hand, clearly we wouldn't need to be thinking about it in a more holistic way. It's a really important one, but we're just scratching the surface relative to many of the other indicators. And resilience. Much of the conversation, think of Woodbridge, was around resilience and other such conversations. But I'll invite you to expand the notion of resilience from the extreme events, be it an extreme weather event or an extreme social event, so a terrorist attack or something like that, to all of the changes that we face as communities on a daily basis. And I'll give you an example. Aging. I'd venture to imagine that everybody watching this webinar is aging. But how many of you have or live in environments that are truly designed to age in place? Probably very few, because we are facing all kinds of changes in our lives, and we often do not have the foresight or build the resilience to anticipate aging, but changes in economics, changes in employment, changes in demographics, let alone changes in the environment that we are encountering all over the place. So we need to be thinking about, how do we adapt to these changes? How are we better at the other end? And what are the resilience planning that any given community needs to be thinking about? Third domain is the economic, and this is really the ability for communities. We know that one of the social indicators of health is income, but how are all the aspects of a community really thought about? Affordability as the first indicator often takes us to think about affordable housing. But not all of you will have the ability to have an inflection on affordable housing. But the impact at a household level comes from a variety of different places. I'll give you an example. Canadians, on average, over their lifespan, will spend 30% of their household income on housing, but they will spend 19% on transportation and 11% on utilities. So combined transportation and utilities is the same amount that they spend on their house. So if we can design a net zero home where people can live without a car, we've just liberated all of the household income equal to the price of their home. So we need to be thinking about affordability in a holistic way, and how does the choices that a community makes, the choices that a family and an individual make, start to really affect now the impact with all other aspects. Complete communities, that's the notion that if we can do all of these things within walking scale, a lot of the benefits compound, but also life cycle costing. This is if the distance matters, the time also matters. We need to be bringing into all of our conversations the thinking of the full life cycle, from the sourcing of a material to the design, to the construction, to the maintenance and the operations, all the way to the disposal, but really start to think about all aspects. And ultimately as well, the local economy. If we can make a dollar spin within the economy of a society, of a community, we'll start to accrue greater benefits. But it also has to do with creating opportunities for local talent, or creating opportunities for people who live in our spaces to be able to thrive economically. Think of a single mom trying to run a home business. If she's required to start and rent a space outside of her home to start a home business, it will never happen. But if she can run it from home at the same time as take care of the kids and without an additional cost, without an additional overhead, now we can start to create a supportive environment for people. Cultural domain, and this is a really important one in terms of the sense of place and identity. Certainly kind of access to cultural and recreational vitality is one of the key indicators. But this is not just about access to museums and galleries and sports venues. This is about us understanding who we are and how does that connect to the spaces that we inhabit. Think of the cultural alienation of Indigenous communities in Canada these days. Walking through cities, walking through environments and not being able to recognize elements of their own history and their own identity through the environments that we inhabit. What does that do to your sense of self, to your self of identity, to the sense of who you are and how you are welcomed into the world? We really need to be thinking about, right back to that welcoming indicator. Who is participating in these environments? Who is participating in the conversation? And how are we creating access to culture in these places? Because this truly connects to this sense of belonging. We know that environments that have a strong sense of belonging, have a strong culture of volunteerism, have a strong engagement from a civic perspective, builds that social networks, builds that social capital that enables people to withstand big changes in their lives, in the communities, be way more resilient, but also connect back into the sense of responsibility and stewardship over the land and over our heritage resources. Play, I love this indicator. It's one that in the literature continues to emerge. And this is the ability for all of us to engage creatively with our environment. And it's not just children, it's everybody else. But also think about learning. And this is the opportunity for people to truly understand why all of this matters, why this conversation is a critical one for them to participate in. The last domain is the political domain, and that's the ability for people to participate in the conversation. So the first indicator is, do we actually have an integrated process? Do we have a process that is inclusive, that is enabling all the voices that need to participate through this process? And is it a collaborative process? Did we create a safe environment for people to participate? And that's not just through the design of a building or a park or a neighborhood. It's also through its life, its operations, its maintenance, the changes that it will face all through its life. Because this is key to this last indicator. And I really want you to think about this whole conversation around heritage conservation and climate adaptation and mitigation from the perspective of when we have a strong sense of ownership and stewardship, when we are doing things that are truly enabling a community to take that stewardship and own it and feel like they are part of the process and can really own this. Anything we can do to enable this strong sense of ownership and stewardship is going to move forward conversations around conservation, but also climate. So, lots of questions in there. What does it actually look like? Well, frankly, it's just taking some of these questions out to communities. So this is in Kingston, the town of North Kingstown, which is just north of the downtown. This is one of the lower income communities in Kingston, but one also with an incredibly rich history going back thousands of years, as it was part of the trading routes within the context of the St. Lawrence River. And frankly, when the community participated and started to address all of these different questions, they built not only a strong sense of who they are and the identity and how we could start to focus conservation of landscapes and the district itself and many of the structures, but also built some climate resilience and mitigation and adaptation strategies within the community and develop a whole new land use plan. But this is the city of Ottawa. Also, you can see them having engaging on some of these conversations. This one I loved. This was with OCAD. They actually decided to dress up and represent the different domains. 4 of those 5 facilitators are all Indigenous, and they were really leading a conversation that anchored back as well into their own lived experience. But we can start to think about this as many different places. It's anchoring the notion that how we design our environments, the environments that we build and live in, and how we manage them have the potential to address some of these big challenges of our day. Today I'm in Edmonton. This is the Brewery District, which is again an adaptive transformation of an old industrial site being transformed to new contemporary uses, while at the same time bringing forward that sense of identity, that sense of place into part of a brand new future. Centennial College, this is in Scarborough in the Toronto region, which is bringing forward an idea of designing, but from Indigenous perspectives. This is the central space that allows now a community to tell the story, to embed that into the life of students, but also help them move it forward and help it move into different places. Granville Island, many of you may have visited this site. This is what it looked like in the 1950s, an old industrial area owned by the federal government. But if you go there today, it's completely transformed, and it's a living part of the city that is also not just the place where people work. There's still a cement plant in the middle of it all. It's also a place where people find identity and that sense of place. The last one I'll show is a Sears Crosstown. This is in Memphis, one of the old Sears buildings that had been abandoned, but also in a community that was incredibly disenfranchised through the construction of a highway and redlining and the zoning, and it was a community in huge turmoil. Today, the transformation of that building, bringing forward a sense of the history, but also completely changing the vision of what a future could look like, has become a new anchor within the community. It has a university and a hospital and residential and mixed use and a whole bunch of incubator businesses in the middle of it. So the question for us now is, what are you going to do? What are you going to do within your own communities? And more importantly, how are you going to articulate this notion of being a bridge and facilitating a conversation about creating a bridge between the past, that legacy that we inherit, and the future and the vision of the future that you want to articulate? And I want you to think very clearly around this question. You remember at the beginning of today, I asked you about your sense of identity. Now bring that into this question. And I'm hoping that some of you in the chat can chime into answering this question. How is it that your sense of place, the place that you inhabit within your communities, that sense of identity that you bring forward, is going to enable us to facilitate a conversation that brings the natural systems, the planet that we want to conserve and adapt and mitigate the climate for and adapt from, but also the cultural landscapes and the heritage that we bring forward. But importantly, how has it become relevant into the future? And how do we connect that into the visions of the cities that we want? Because remember that you're facilitating this process. The bringing people along and engaging the community is fundamental to arriving at a meaningful outcome and an implementable outcome. So it's not just a question of the what, it's clearly a question of the why. Why are we doing this? And I'll always invite us to be thinking it's about the people and how is this relevant to the communities with which we work. So I'll pause here and open it up to see if anyone has comments, questions. Cecile, how's our chat doing?
Well, first of all, I would like to thank you for an excellent if I may say, inspirational presentation, despite this is a very complex and challenging context that we are addressing, of course. But I would like to also say that what I really appreciate about this session is the opportunity to learn from other professionals and practitioners that come in and share how their practice and view in their own profession is evolving in the context of climate change. I'm an economist, and I realize when we discuss matters of how we deal with in the future of climate change, it's no longer that we are so separated. We actually come together, and it is, as you say, about the people. It's about relationships. It's the relational level. How do we design and co-create solutions towards these challenges? So we have one question, and it's from Ali, and he asks, how can we design adaptive heritage conservation strategies that address climate change impacts and promote intergenerational community well-being?
Yeah, and so I would make that a question that you would host at a community level, right, with policymakers and with members of the community, because the answer to that one will be very different. Ultimately, I do believe that we can only wag our fingers from a distance so far, and unless people within communities are really able to take ownership and understand why this matters and really bring it forward, it's going to be really hard to implement solutions that are truly going to be transformative. So the question in many regards is one of, if we can understand how do we articulate this as part of the vision of the future, then it's easier for us to understand what is it that we move forward, right? If a building or a natural system or something does not find its place in our vision for the future, it's going to be really hard for any community to maintain it relevant. And as we've known, it might be that we can create policies to just kind of bang our fists on the table and argue that something needs to be designated today, but it just takes one generation or one session of council that no longer finds it relevant, that no longer care for it to be destroyed. So the biggest question in my mind has always been, how are we making it? Why should my children care? Why should they want to conserve the natural system, or why should they want to conserve this heritage district or this cultural resource, right? And if we can anchor it in the future, then we'll be able to create a path for moving it forward.
Thank you. Okay, the next question. In the historical nomadic environments where I live, what solution do you suggest for the life of nomads whose lives are mostly based on intangible heritage, as their way of life is changing faster based on climate change?
Wow, that's a gorgeous question. So I mentioned early on that I grew up in the land of the Masawa and the Nahuatl. So the Nahuatl are the folks who are also the Aztecs and kind of created some huge urban environments. But the Masawa, conversely, are traders. They're nomads. They inhabited tremendous amounts of roots around all of the country, and they basically wove between many of the communities in central Mexico, and actually all the way down to South America, and they connected all kinds of different environments. So how to bring forward their sense of place and their sense of identity, and even the language has certainly been a very unique challenge when communities don't see pyramids or artifacts or things moving forward. So I appreciate the question, because I see it firsthand, in a very different context. Language is a huge part Art is a huge component. Storytelling is a huge component. Really understanding the bigger landscapes, not just the built landscapes, but the natural landscapes, the routes, the pathways. You know, how can we bring those forward? Is really emerging now as an important conversation. And I don't have an answers, but I recognize the challenge of maintaining a sense of identity in place moving forward with communities that may have less visible, tangible objects.
Thank you. Then we have a question from Livingston. Looking at the future, what is the current knowledge as regards to adaptive reuse of cultural heritage and technological integration?
So I would say it's only starting. It's really only, especially from an environmental perspective. So if you think of the adaptive reuse of structures, you know, clearly we've been doing that for thousands of years, right? How many Roman structures are currently being reused as something different? And in fact, it's really hard to conserve something if there isn't a future use into it. So buildings, we've been adapting from a heritage perspective on a number of different fronts. But where I think we're really only scratching the surface is now from an environmental perspective. We need to get much better at being able to use existing structures. We're not going to do significant climate mitigation only through new buildings. We need to do it through all of the existing buildings. So we need to get much better at adapting the structures we currently inhabit to be able to meet the vision of the future, right? The standards, the goals that we have established ourselves. We're having a serious conversation around embodied carbon, having a serious conversation around not creating a bigger impact by building new materials is one that we need to have, which in some regards, the coincidence between climate goals and heritage conservation goals is actually a positive, because it means that now the vision of that old building that we would have demolished without a second thought is going to cause pause. People are going to be thinking about it again, and we're going to have the ability to think very carefully of existing structures, let alone existing landscapes, before we start to transform them with such abandon as we have in the past. I see heritage buildings as a non-renewable resource in the same way that much of our ecosystem services are, right?
Yes, and that brings us to the dimension of stewardship, and how do we steward heritage as commons, and not only as properties that are owned. So that so now is a question for me on the economics. So what is your experience of the emergent economic shift towards more circular and ideally regenerative economics, and how does that support or challenge the what you are experiencing as an architect in the urban design and economics of architecture?
Yes. So in that adaptive reuse conversation, there needs to be a business case, right? There needs to be an ROI, return on investment level. And we can think it in the kind of the macroeconomic, just to bring it into your terms, you know, how does a society reinvest, say, in tourist areas, which I know is your area of specialty, but also in the microeconomics, right? How does a family, a household think about the decisions that they're making on a daily basis? And we've seen in many instances conversations around, say, for example, you know, the energy unit that I'm going to build into my unit, right? Or the choices around heaters, and we see those on cars and many other choices that are being made at a household income level. And until such time as those truly now households and families can make the decisions that collectively are going to have the impact that we want to have, until such time as we can enable those in a positive way, we're not going to see that tipping point, because there's only so much that we can do at a federal government policy level, right? Or at a macroeconomic level. And in fact, some of those levers are already being drawn to the extent that we can. You know, I'm a true believer that if we can incent the right behaviors, right, and kind of nudge in that way, you know, active lifestyles, right, we can make it easy for people to make the right choices. And this is where the learning indicator comes in, and we can really build awareness around why those things matter, and people can take stewardship of their own natural and cultural landscapes. This is where we need to be doing a tremendous amount of work, right? Because if communities don't care, they don't care about each other, they don't care about the environment, they don't care about the culture and the heritage, there's nothing you can do that is going to move it forward, right?
Thank you very much for that. I don't think we don't have any more questions in the chat. So unless someone quickly writes something.
So I have a question for you, Cecile, because I know that you know, tourism is your particular area of expertise in terms of heritage. You know, this of course creates an environment where you're not only dealing with the past community, the present community, and you know, the unborn community or kind of the future generations. You're also dealing now with a world community kind of coming in and coming out, right? It creates a particularly interesting dynamic when maybe the benefits are accrued by different people than those who may be participating through the conversation.
Yeah, that's a comment and the question. Yes, of course, it's very challenging, and that is why my focus has turned more to how do we empower communities to take more charge of their future, because tourism-dependent communities are very vulnerable, and in the future we don't know what's going to happen. The water, housing, energy need to be shared by many more, and we're going to see huge migration coming, yeah, so the future of tourism is very uncertain. So it's all about design, both physical design, but also the economic design. How do we create economics where we can actually more efficiently share and fairly distribute limited resources? So yeah, I'm not sure if that answered your question.
No, it does. And I see one in the chat, people are asking, like, do you spend attention on the artifacts and the monuments, or on the people and the threats to a community and the sense of identity of the community, right? Tough question, and I don't think there's an either or, and in some regards it's a false dichotomy, because you almost need to do them both, and by doing both, doing one does not negate the other. But I appreciate that sometimes in the context of limited resources is, you know, do you conserve the monument, or do you create, you know, a language school and for children so that they can conserve the language, right? You kind of need to do them both.
Yeah, and as you said, it's all about the relevance. And one thing that I'm interested in also, one thing is how do we bring a representative group of people around the table, but how could we also recognize the needs of the future generations and the rights of nature? These also need to be recognized stakeholders that somehow have their rights protected. I see now that we come to the end of our time. Now suddenly we had two more questions. So do we have time for that? Francesco, Ali?
On our end, yes, that's fine. I just want to be mindful of yours and Antonio's time, but yeah, we can continue the discussion if you're both okay.
I'm fine with that. How about you, Antonio?
Well, that's good.
Okay, yes, then we have a question from Frank, a really challenging idea. Unfortunately, I see many communities at present are torn apart and are not up to the task of dealing with emergency in a common sense. Okay, so that was a comment. Livingston, my question has not been answered. Please, I'm talking of the integration of technologies, emerging ones, and the future of cultural heritage conservation, architectural. We could bring Livingston in to elaborate on the question if that's necessary.
Sounds good.
Yeah,
Livingston?
Livington, if you want to raise your hand, if you have a microphone, I can give you. Oh, yeah, there you are. I'll allow you to talk now. Yeah, you can just unmute and yeah, join the conversation.
Okay, good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
I want to appreciate you for this privilege. I basically am talking of we have emerging technologies like the common one like AI. We have the visual reality. We have HBeam. We have all sort of emerging technologies. Then we look at GIS, GIM, that's Geographical Information System, Geographical Information Modeling. Now we're looking at the future. These technologies are emerging. What is the research gap presently from the practice or the practical point of view of these technologies as regards to conservation of architectural heritages? I don't know if you got my question, please.
Yes. And of course, not just the emerging technologies, but the rhythm of change in a lot of their technologies is both daunting and incredibly exciting, right? Frankly, one of them is the very technology by which we are having this very conversation. The fact that Zoom is now here and we can do all of these kinds of things is enabling now people from around the globe to participate in this conversation and hopefully take something out of it. So just from a public engagement, from a community and expertise engagement perspective, we're already experiencing how technology is enabling something that maybe 10, 20, 30 years ago would have not been possible, let alone many of the technologies, Livingston, that you described. We're seeing transformations in not just the construction methods and how those can enable, but even some of the ability to document the heritage and better understand the context in which we're working. So we're doing a lot of, say, 3D scannings of entire streetscapes. We're sending a drone, doing a full 3D scan, and then that gets embedded into the CAD systems, and we can build a Revit model from a live scan of an urban environment. So now we can do the heritage conservation of that, and robotic arms are rebuilding stone masonry elements to kind of bring those forward in Parliament Hill and in other places. So technology is enabling a lot of these things. It still anchors around the question of why do we do this and how do we do it? Technology is not the solution. Technology is an enabler, and it depends on how we choose to deploy it. By the same token, the acceleration of technology is causing a lot of the challenges, climate change amongst them, right? And certainly the impact that a lot of communities are seeing and how their means of production, their economy, local economies are being transformed. And for us to be able to see those coming and have some serious conversations is really key as well.
Okay,
Then we
I
have,
think
yeah.
I think that's okay. That's okay. Thank you very much.
So then we have one final question before we close, and that's not in the chat, but it's when a natural phenomenon happens, it may cause relocating people who are the main elements of the past heritage and the new community who will live area construct a bit different places, which will be the future heritage. In your opinion, which cultural heritage monuments has more priority to be preserved considering economical challenges? The built heritage from the past community or the current community that creates future cultural heritage, or both?
Yeah, and I think that's the question that I picked up. Is it, do you invest in the monuments or do you invest in the people? But I'll draw attention to an element of the beginning of the question, which was also the increased displacement of people. it is the case today that the majority of world refugees are not war refugees, they're climate refugees. And this is only going to increase. And you remember my slide right at the beginning that 85% of the population are under the poverty line, right? 85% of the world population. So if you think about the extreme weather events now having an impact on coastal communities and all, areas that are subject to both droughts and floods and extreme heats and all of these elements, you can see how in the not distant future, we're only going to see an increase in the displacement of a lot of communities around the world. So it's really critical for us to be thinking about how do we do better conservation of the natural systems and climate mitigation, but at the same time address the relocation, the adaptation, the mitigation, and the resilience of many of these communities. And how does that transition not result in a complete, not just displacement of them physically, but a displacement of their identity, a displacement of their sense of who they are and how they can contribute to then be part of society. So people have moved over the centuries, many different places. It's this scale at which it's happening and how that society, that culture has the ability to adapt as they continue to move into different places. Real challenge.
Thank you very much, Antonio. Thank you for your inspiring and thought-provoking presentation. I believe we come to an end, and so I'll hand it over to Francesco.
Well, and if I may just, Cecile, thank you for facilitating and managing all of this. And thanks, Francesco and Courage, for orchestrating.
Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to echo my thanks as well. And also on behalf of Professor Esgary, thank you so much for taking the time to present today. It was a great presentation, really informative. And I liked that it was interactive a little bit as well. So it was, yeah, that was great. That was great. It was great to see your perspective on all of this. So yeah, thank you so much. And thank you, of course, Cecily, for moderating today's session and of course for being a partner on this series. And again, thank you to everyone in the audience as well for being here, for taking the time to join us today, asking questions, participating. I hope you also found it as interesting and informative as we did. And yeah, we do these sessions for the people who come and participate. So thank you so much for being interested and for coming today. And as always, our sessions are recorded and they are put up on our YouTube page and on the event page a few hours after the session. And so they will be up later this afternoon. So if anybody wants to revisit the presentation or share it within your networks, anyone who might have missed it would be interested, please feel free to do so as well. And just one last final reminder, this is a monthly speaker series on the first Monday of every month. Aside from this month because of the holiday here in Canada. But yeah, the next session will be on August 5th. So also please mark that on your calendar and share that with anyone who might not have been registered yet in your network who might find it interesting. Registrations are always open and free for these series. So with that, just one last big final thank you to everybody. It was a great session. Thank you so much. And I hope everybody has a great rest of their day. Thank you.
Thank you, Antonio.